You're trapped in complete darkness, a stone cell beneath a castle. You've been here for 6 days. The only opening, a small gap at ground level, is the only thing keeping you alive. That's where they pass your bread. That's where you see light, but today that light is disappearing. You hear the sound of a trowel, mortar spreading, stone being set into place. They're sealing it. They're sealing you in. You press your face toward the opening. You can see hands, tools. You recognize the castle steward, a man you've known your entire life. You call out to him. You beg him. You tell him it's a mistake, that you did nothing wrong, that a simple conversation with a visiting nobleman isn't betrayal, that your husband is lying, that this is madness. He doesn't even look at you. He turns and walks away. The first stone rises into place, then another and another. The light shrinks, your voice cracks. You're screaming now, but nobody hears you over the sound of the work. Nobody comes. The opening gets smaller and smaller until there's nothing but darkness. Complete, total, absolute darkness. For the next 42 days, you will sit on cold stone in that blackness. They'll pass minimal food and water through a gap that barely exists. You'll go slowly mad. You'll lose track of time. You won't know if it's day or night. You won't know if anyone is ever coming to let you out, and then you'll die. This actually happened in 1379. Her name was Elena. Her crime was having a conversation with a nobleman about state finances. If you enjoy exploring the darkest chapters of human history, stories that reveal how entire civilizations normalize systematic violence against women, how accusations became weapons deadlier than swords, how justice systems were designed to destroy rather than protect, then please like this video and subscribe to Quiet Historians. I'm genuinely curious where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell me your location. What happened to Elena was not unique. It was one method among dozens that medieval Europe used to punish women accused of adultery. And what I'm about to tell you is documented. Court records, church archives, legal codes, chronicles written by medieval people themselves. These aren't legends. These are real punishments that happened to real women. By the end of this video, you'll understand that medieval Europe's treatment of accused adulteresses was worse than execution, worse than torture, worse than anything most people can imagine. To understand what medieval society did to women accused of adultery, you first need to understand how the accusation itself worked. Because the accusation was the weapon, once it was made, a woman had almost no way to defend herself. In medieval Europe, a husband's word was law. His testimony about his wife's behavior carried absolute weight. It didn't matter if he had witnessed anything himself. It didn't matter if there was physical evidence. His accusation was treated as truth by default. His interpretation of events was reality. A woman could be condemned for being seen talking to a man who wasn't her husband, for smiling, for laughing, for asking questions, for lingering too long at the well, for showing interest in anything beyond her narrow domestic sphere. The standard of proof was not beyond reasonable doubt. It was simply suspicion based on appearance of impropriety. And here's what made the system absolutely airtight. Women were not allowed to testify in their own defense in cases involving moral offenses. The legal reasoning was that women were naturally deceptive, that they couldn't be trusted to tell the truth about their own behavior, that their testimony would inevitably be lies designed to escape punishment. Only male testimony mattered. Only a man's word could be trusted. Medieval law codes across Christian Europe were explicit about this. A woman's voice in her own trial counted for nothing. Her protests of innocence were legally irrelevant. In the Saxon Spiegel, a German law code from the 13th century had stated plainly, a wife's defense against adultery charges was inadmissible because women were inherently prone to deception. The Carolina, the criminal code of the Holy Roman Empire from 1532, reinforced this principle across multiple regions and centuries. So once an accusation was made, conviction was almost inevitable. And once conviction happened, the real destruction began. In villages and towns across medieval Europe, the first punishment for an accused adulteress was always public, always visible, always designed to be witnessed by everyone. She would be dragged from her home, sometimes literally pulled by her hair through the streets. In some villages in southern Germany and Austria, her hair would be grabbed by the roots, and she'd be yanked along the cobblestones while crowds gathered. Her scalp would bleed, her dress would tear. By the time she reached the town square, her face was already bruised, her body already traumatized. In England, she might be brought to the pillory. In Germany, she might be stripped naked and walk through the entire village while being whipped. In France, the procedures varied, but the intent never did. Public destruction of reputation. The woman's clothing would be torn from her body in front of neighbors, in front of children, in front of people she'd known her entire life. The shame of this exposure was deliberately calculated. Medieval women were taught from childhood that their bodies must never be seen. That exposure was the ultimate violation of modesty, that only a husband should ever see a wife's naked form. Now hundreds of people stared at her, and they didn't just stare, they participated. Her hair, which had been braided and styled as a mark of her status as a married woman, would be cut, not carefully, not gently. A woman from the village would approach with sheep shears, the dull blades meant for cutting wool from animals, not designed for human hair. The shears would pull and tear at the scalp more than cut. Strands would be ripped out by the roots. Blood would run down her neck. Children would watch and learn. Sometimes her head would be completely shaved. A razor would scrape her scalp, leaving it raw and bleeding. The removal of her hair was symbolic and brutal. It was erasing her identity as a woman, mocking her as shameful, removing the very markers of femininity that her social position depended on. Once stripped and shorn, she would be displayed. In the pillory in England, a wooden framework with holes for the head and hands. She would be locked into an extremely uncomfortable bent-over position that made breathing difficult and caused severe back and neck pain within minutes. The holes were deliberately small, pressing against the throat. The position was deliberately agonizing. Standing in a pillory for even 1 hour was torture. Standing for 3 hours, which was standard, was a form of slow physical destruction. And while she stood there unable to move, unable to protect herself, unable to do anything except endure, the entire community participated in her punishment. This wasn't passive observation. This was active participatory violence. In medieval justice systems, the crowd was expected to join in, to add their own expressions of moral outrage to the official punishment, to demonstrate their own virtue by attacking the condemned. Refusing to participate was suspicious. It suggested sympathy for the adulteress, which could mark you as potentially corrupt yourself. So everyone joined in, women, men, children. They threw things, rotten vegetables that had been saved specifically for this purpose. The contents of chamber pots, mud mixed with animal waste, spoiled eggs. The refuse would splatter across her face and body, covering her in filth. But worse than the physical impact was what it meant. She was being treated as garbage, as something to be disposed of. They threw stones, not large ones that would cause serious injury or death. The authorities didn't want to kill her. They wanted her to survive to serve as an ongoing example. But stones large enough to hurt when they struck. They would hit her arms and legs and back, drawing blood, opening small wounds that would become infected. They threw insults, faithless woman, betrayer of your husband, devil's bride, corrupted flesh. Each insult was designed to destroy what remained of her dignity. Not just physically, psychologically. She was being told again and again by everyone she knew that she was worthless, that she was less than human, that she deserved this, that she had brought this upon herself through her own wickedness, and the children participated. Their parents lifted them up to get better angles for throwing, handed them particularly disgusting items to throw at the woman in the pillory. Young boys, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, competed with each other to see who could hit her with the most disgusting projectiles. They laughed and celebrated each successful throw as if it were a game. They were learning. Through direct participation, they were learning that this was proper treatment for women who violated their marriage vows. They were internalizing the message that female virtue must be guarded at all costs, because the punishment for failure was complete social destruction. Young girls watched from the edges of the crowd, their mothers holding their hands or standing behind them with hands on their shoulders, all of them learning what would happen if they ever strayed from absolute obedience to their future husbands. The parade through the streets served the same function. The woman would be forced to walk, sometimes completely naked, through every street of the village. The route had been carefully planned to take her past every house, down every lane, to ensure that every resident witnessed her humiliation. A man would follow directly behind her with a whip, striking her across her back and legs with each step. The whip would leave red welts. After the first several strikes, it would break the skin. Blood would run down her back and legs. She would scream with each blow, unable to maintain any dignity or composure. Reduced to an animal-like state of pure suffering, the man wielding the whip showed no mercy, no variation in his rhythm, just strike after strike after strike as she stumbled forward through village streets. But the whipping wasn't the only violence. The entire village participated, women who had known her for years, women she had worked alongside in the fields, women whose children played with her children. These women spat on her as she passed, shouted insults through things, rotten vegetables, animal waste, mud, men threw stones, made crude jokes about her body, reduced her to an object for their amusement. The children threw projectiles and laughed, learning their lessons about women's vulnerability and women's place. The parade lasted for hours, multiple times through the village to ensure maximum witnesses and maximum participation. By the end, the woman was barely recognizable as a human being, her naked body covered completely in mud, blood, animal waste, and rotten vegetables, her back and legs torn open from the whipping, her feet bleeding from walking barefoot over rough ground and sharp stones, bruised from head to foot from stones, barely conscious, barely able to stand. But the punishment wasn't finished. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in southern Germany and Austria, branding came next. The woman would be taken before the blacksmith. An iron rod would be heated in the forge until it glowed bright red, hot enough to boil water on contact. The rod would be shaped into a letter, usually an A for adulteress, or in some regions an H for hurry or some other mark of shame. The blacksmith would press this glowing metal against her flesh, typically on the face, the cheek, or the forehead, where everyone who saw her for the rest of her life would immediately know what she'd been convicted of. The sizzle of burning flesh would be audible across the entire square. The smell of burning skin and hair would fill the air. She would scream, a sound of such pure agony that it seemed inhuman. The blacksmith would hold the iron in place for several seconds to ensure the brand would scar permanently, would be deep enough to read easily, would mark her forever. When removed, her flesh would be charred black in the center with red blistering skin around it. Blood mixed with clear fluid would ooze from the wound. Everyone who saw her from that moment forward would know. They would see the letter burned into her skin, and they would know immediately what she'd been convicted of. She would never be able to hide her shame. She would never be able to start over somewhere else where people didn't know her history. The brand announced her disgrace to anyone who looked at her face. In some regions, branding wasn't enough. In medieval Germany, particularly, mutilation was standard. After the public whipping and humiliation, the woman's left ear would be cut off. Not surgically, not cleanly. The blacksmith would use a knife, normally used for cutting leather and rope. He would grab her ear and saw through it while she was held down by men. The cartilage was tough. It took time. It hurt beyond description. The severed ear would be dropped to the ground, where it would be trampled by the crowd pressing forward to see better. The wound would bleed profusely. There was no anesthesia, no pain relief, just the agony of having your body mutilated in front of hundreds of people. Then her forehead would be branded with a red-hot iron, shaped like the letter H. The smell of burning flesh, the impossibly loud scream, the blacksmith holding the iron in place to ensure it was deep and permanent. These marks served a purpose beyond the immediate punishment. They were permanent reminders. They prevented escape. When the woman tried to leave her village and start over somewhere else, the brand on her face announced to everyone she encountered exactly what she had been convicted of. In some regions, the meanings of brands were standardized across territories. A for adulteress, T for thief, H for heretic. So, anyone who saw the mark knew instantly. The woman would be driven away from town after town, sometimes with threats, sometimes with actual violence. Men would throw stones at her until she fled. Magistrates would order her to leave immediately on pain of being whipped. Women would surround her and beat her with sticks, accusing her of trying to corrupt their community with her presence. In England and some parts of France, another punishment came after the branding and public humiliation, the ducking stool. The woman would be brought to the river and forced into a wooden chair attached to a long beam that worked like a lever. Her arms would be bound to the armrests, her body secured with rope. She had no ability to move or protect herself. The operator would pull the lever, and she would be plunged into the water that was often fed by snow melting spring, brutally cold, sometimes just above freezing. The sudden immersion would cause her to gasp involuntarily and inhale water into her lungs. She would choke. She would struggle against her bonds. Her lungs would burn. Her vision would darken at the edges. Just as she was on the verge of losing consciousness, the operator would pull the lever again and raise her out of the water. She would break the surface, coughing and gasping, vomiting up water, her body shaking violently from the cold. But she would be given only seconds to catch her breath before being plunged under again. This would happen 20 times, 30 times, sometimes more. Each immersion counted aloud by the crowd who chanted the numbers in unison like spectators at a grotesque sporting event. 1, 2, 3. Each time she went under, she was held there longer, the operator carefully calibrating how long he could keep her submerged without actually killing her. Walking the line between punishment and execution. By the 10th ducking, many women stopped struggling. They hung limp in the chair between immersions. By the 15th, they were no longer making any sound when they came up from the water. Their skin would be blue from cold, their breathing shallow and labored. Some in the crowd would murmur that perhaps this was enough, that perhaps they were going to kill her, that perhaps the punishment was going too far. But the operator continued, following the sentence that had been pronounced, the traditional number of duckings for an adulteress. By the final ducking, the woman appeared more dead than alive. The medical aftermath of these punishments was devastating and permanent. The infections that developed from the branding, the contamination from the river water during ducking, the wounds from whipping, these didn't heal cleanly. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacteria or antiseptic technique. The burns would become severely infected within days. The flesh would swell massively, turning dark purple and green with streaks of red spreading outward that indicated blood poisoning. The woman would develop a high fever, her body fighting multiple infections simultaneously. Some survived the initial infection. Others died from sepsis within weeks, but the physical damage was only part of it. The social destruction was total and permanent. Once convicted, the woman's marriage was automatically dissolved. In most of medieval Europe, when a marriage was dissolved due to the wife's adultery, the husband kept all marital property. Not just property the couple had acquired during the marriage. but even the dowry that the woman's family had provided when she married, the dowry that was supposed to be her security, her protection, her insurance against poverty. Her husband took everything, the house, the furnishings, the money, the goods. The woman was left with literally nothing except the filthy dress she had been wearing during her punishments. She couldn't work in any respectable trade. No one would hire a woman branded on the face as an adulteress. The brand was specifically designed to make her unemployable, to ensure she could never rebuild a normal life. She couldn't work as a servant in any respectable household because her presence would corrupt the moral atmosphere. That was the actual belief. Morality was thought to be contagious in medieval society, both virtue and vice spreading from person to person through association. A branded adulteress in a household would contaminate the virtue of the other servants, or so the reasoning went. She couldn't work with other women in textile production, the most common form of women's work, because the other women refused to associate with her. They claimed she would corrupt them, or that they couldn't be seen associating with such a woman without damaging their own reputations. The only work available to her was the most degrading and dangerous, collecting refuse from the streets, cleaning latrines, perhaps selling her body. Though even in that profession, her brand made her less desirable than unmarked women. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all the woman herself. She had been branded as an adulteress for allegedly committing adultery. Now, the only way she could survive was to actually become what she had been falsely accused of being. She couldn't attend church without people whispering and pointing. The priest would not allow her to take communion or participate in any of the sacraments. She was marked as outside the community of Christian souls, not quite formally excommunicated, but effectively excluded from full participation in Christian religious life. In medieval Europe, that meant she was excluded from the most important aspects of community belonging. Children would follow her in the streets, chanting "Adulteress, adulteress" in mocking sing-gong voices, throwing small stones or mud at her. Adults would spit at her when she passed, throw things, repeat the violence of her public punishment on a smaller scale every day. She was effectively exiled while remaining physically in the same town, isolated among people she had known her entire life. Some women tried to escape, to leave their villages and find somewhere new to start over. But the brand on their face made this impossible. It was specifically designed to be permanent, to be immediately recognizable, to announce to anyone who saw it exactly what crime the bearer had committed. In every town and village they entered, people saw the letter burned into their skin and knew immediately what it meant. The meanings of brands were standardized across much of Europe. A for adulteress, T for thief, H for heretic, and so on. Brands were designed to be a permanent mark that followed the criminal forever, preventing them from escaping their past and starting over. These women were driven away from town after town, sometimes with threats, sometimes with actual violence. In one town, men threw stones at them until they fled. In another, they were dragged before the local magistrate, who ordered them to leave immediately on pain of being whipped. In a third, women surrounded them and beat them with sticks, accusing them of trying to corrupt their community with their presence. They survived by begging on the roads between settlements, sleeping in ditches or abandoned buildings, eating whatever scraps they could find, learning to approach people carefully, their head down, their branded cheek turned away, trying to get them to give something before they saw the mark and understood what they were. The chronic illness from the punishments weakened them progressively. The repeated near drownings caused permanent damage to lungs. The infection from the brand spread through tissue, causing permanent damage to nerves. Chronic pain that never fully went away. Facial paralysis, scarring that pulled the mouth into a permanent grimace. Some died on the roads after a few years, found in ditches frozen in winter. Their bodies buried in unmarked graves in unconsecrated ground. The area reserved for criminals, beggars, and others deemed unworthy of Christian burial. Their deaths were recorded in parish registers with no name, no age, no mention of family. Simply an adulterous woman found dead on the roadside. For noble women, the punishment was different on the surface, but equally devastating. A noble woman couldn't be subjected to the public whipping and branding that was used on peasant women. Her family was too powerful. If she was visibly scarred or publicly mutilated, it would create a blood feud. It would trigger obligations of revenge that could lead to actual war between families. So instead, she was disappeared, locked away in a convent in a remote region, somewhere accessible only by difficult mountain paths, isolated from other settlements, a place where women could be locked away and forgotten. These weren't comfort establishments for noble daughters. They were penitentiaries specifically designed to house women whose families wanted them disappeared. She would be stripped of her noble clothing and dressed in a coarse woolen habit. Her hair would be shaved completely bald. She would be locked in a cell barely large enough to lie down in. She would be fed one minimal meal per day. She would be allowed out only for religious services 7 times throughout each day and night. Services where she would be required to publicly confess her adultery before the community of nuns. She would be forbidden from speaking to any of the other imprisoned women, cut off completely from the outside world. No letters, no visitors, no news of whether her family had tried to intervene. No knowledge of what happened to anyone she had known. She would spend decades in that cell. 23 years for one woman, 30 years for another. More than 2 decades locked in a few square feet of stone, praying the same prayers over and over, fasting until her body was skeletal, insisting to God, if not to her captives, that she had done nothing wrong. And the system ensured that most of the time she hadn't. That's the truth at the heart of all this. Most of the women convicted of adultery in medieval Europe were probably innocent. The accusation was the weapon, the trial was a formality, the punishment was the point. A husband who wanted to get rid of his wife. A son who saw his wife as a threat to his inheritance. A man humiliated by village gossip. A lord who wanted to make an example. These men had a legal system that gave them absolute power to destroy any woman they accused. The accusation didn't require proof. It only required suspicion. And suspicion could be manufactured from almost anything. A conversation, a smile, a lingering glance, interest in anything beyond the narrow confines of domestic duty. That was the system. That was medieval justice for women accused of adultery. Not mercy, not investigation, not justice, destruction. Complete, systematic, normalized destruction of women's bodies, women's minds, women's entire existence. Elena died in that sealed cell after 42 days. Marjorie died 2 years after her public punishment in a ditch beside a road. Her body so damaged by infection and illness that she couldn't survive. Isabella spent 23 years locked in a convent cell and died there, forgotten by everyone, including her family. Alice was mutilated and died on the roads. Her body left in a ditch to be buried in an unmarked grave. Thousands of women whose names we don't know suffered the same fates. Their stories weren't recorded. Their deaths weren't noted. They disappeared into the machinery of medieval justice, a system designed to control women through terror, to punish any deviation from perfect obedience, to make examples so brutal that other women would be paralyzed with fear at the thought of stepping out of line. The medieval buildings still stand throughout Europe. Tourists visit them every day, but in those squares, women were branded and mutilated. In those convents, women were imprisoned for decades. In those castles, women were sealed into cells and left to die. The stones remember, even if we have forgotten. Remember Elena, remember Marjorie, remember Isabella, remember Alice, remember all the women whose names we do not know. They were people, they suffered, they existed, and the system that destroyed them was designed by the people who built those beautiful medieval buildings that we visit as tourists. That's what I want you to understand from this. That's what I need you to remember. This wasn't ancient history. This was a functioning legal system. This was how justice worked. This was normalized, accepted, expected. This is what happens when societies organize themselves around absolute male authority. When women are considered property, when honor is valued more than truth or justice or human life. But I haven't told you everything yet, because the methods of destruction varied by region, by social class, by the specific cruelty a community could imagine. And the deeper you dig into the historical records, the more you realize that these punishments were not aberrations. They were systems. They were traditions that had been refined over centuries. In the Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon dating back to 1754 B.C., the principle was already established. If a man's wife was caught lying with another man, they would both be bound and thrown into the water. The husband had the power to pardon. The king had the power to pardon his servant. But the woman almost always faced execution. That principle that the woman's punishment was mandatory and the man's was optional persisted across cultures and centuries. In medieval Vienna in the 14th century, the Badstube, the public bathhouse, was not just a place for hygiene. It was a place of public shaming. An accused adulteress would be stripped and paraded through the streets to the bathhouse, where she would be forced to stand naked while the entire community filed past to look at her. The humiliation was compounded by the fact that baths were communal and intimate. She was being exposed in the very space where bodies were normally private. In 15th century Nuremberg, the punishment was documented in meticulous detail in the city's legal records. An accused adulteress would first be brought before the council. Her hair would be cut, not shaved, but cut unevenly, hacked away with dull blades. Then she would be dressed in a special dress, a mark of shame that was sewn with identifying stitches that made it impossible to remove. She would wear this dress continuously. She couldn't take it off. She would sleep in it, work in it, be seen in it by everyone. If she tried to leave the city, the dress would be recognized immediately. Even if she escaped to another town, the stitching pattern would identify her as someone who had been shamed in Nuremberg. Some women were forced to wear these shame dresses for years. Some were forced to wear them for life. In the Low Countries, what is now Belgium and the Netherlands, the punishment often involved the Rhine. Women would be forced into the river not for ducking, but for something worse. They would be placed on a boat with a hole in the bottom. The boat would be sent out into the current. The implication was clear. Whether she drowned depended on whether God thought she was innocent. Most drowned. This was trial by water, trial by ordeal, a system that was supposed to reveal divine judgment, but that actually just ensured that women died. Because there was no way to pass a trial by water. There was no way to survive being put in a leaking boat. But the system gave divine sanction to what was really just execution, disguised as justice. In some parts of southern France, the punishment involved the town square, and a specifically constructed structure called the shame chair. A woman would be seated in this chair, completely naked, elevated so that everyone could see her from every angle. She would be exposed to the elements, left there for hours in summer heat, in winter cold. Men would approach and make comments about her body. Sometimes they would touch her. The chair was designed to be a mo, so she couldn't move away, couldn't protect herself, couldn't do anything but endure. In medieval England, particularly in the 13th and 14th centuries, the legal records show a practice called riding the mare. An accused adulteress would be placed backward on a horse facing the tail instead of the head, and the horse would be led through the village. This was designed to be deeply humiliating. The position was undignified. The message was clear. You are degraded. You're not worthy of facing forward. You're not worthy of the basic dignity of looking where you're going. Some villages modified the practice. The woman would be placed on a donkey instead of a horse, a smaller, more humiliating animal. Some regions added additional cruelty. They would place nettles on the animal's back so that the woman would be stung and pricked as she was paraded through the streets. In the Germanic regions, particularly in what is now Bavaria and Austria, the records show something called the Freenbad, literally the women's bath. But it wasn't a bath, it was a cage. A woman would be placed in an iron cage and lowered into a river or pond, partially submerged. She would be held there while the community gathered to watch. Some cages were designed with specific proportions that allowed the woman to breathe when standing, but not when sitting. She would have to stand the entire time to avoid drowning. When her legs gave out from exhaustion, she would have to choose, drown or give up, and let herself slip underwater. Most drowned eventually. The psychological component of these punishments is what often gets overlooked in historical accounts. It wasn't just the physical destruction. It was the fact that the community participated, that neighbors, people you had known your entire life, turned against you, that other women, took pleasure in your suffering, that children learned to mock you, that the system was designed to make you feel that your suffering was deserved, that you had brought this upon yourself, that everyone was right to hate you. There's a documented case from 1387 in the Bavarian town of Regensburg of a woman named Margaret who was accused of adultery. The trial record shows that her own mother testified against her. Her own sister threw stones at her during the public parade. After her punishment, Margaret tried to reconcile with her family. Her mother refused to see her. Her sister orchestrated her expulsion from the town. Margaret died 3 years later alone in the woods outside the town. A hunter found her body in winter. She had frozen to death. In the Italian city-states, particularly Venice and Genoa, the punishment took on a maritime dimension. Venice was a sea power, and justice was often administered at the docks. An accused adulteress in Venice in the 15th century would be brought to the harbor and placed on a platform in front of the ships. She would be stripped and branded while sailors and merchants watched. The message was clear. All travelers should know what happens to unfaithful women. Some women in Venice were branded with a fleur de, a symbol of shamelessness. The mark was positioned on her breast directly over her heart, so that even if she tried to cover her shame, it was still visible. Women with this mark couldn't rent housing. They couldn't work. They were effectively exiled from society while still living in the city. In smaller villages across Europe, where the social fabric was tighter and the community more isolated, the punishments were often even more brutal because they were less regulated. There was no official oversight. No one from the city was watching to ensure procedures were followed. Local lords had tremendous discretion in how to punish. A case from 1392 in a small English village shows a woman named Joan who was accused of adultery by her husband. The local lord's court was held in the village square. The verdict was reached within an hour. Joan was sentenced to be drowned in the village pond. She was placed in a basket tied to a rope. The rope was tied to a tree at the pond's edge. Joan was lowered into the water and held submerged for a count of 50, then raised, then lowered again. This was repeated 10 times. After the final raising, she was still alive but barely conscious. The court record notes that she was judged to have survived by God's mercy and was therefore declared innocent of the crime of adultery. She was released, but the physical damage was permanent. She developed an infection in her lungs from repeated near-drowning. She coughed blood for the rest of her life. She died 3 years later at age 28. What's particularly cruel about her story is that she was officially proven innocent. Yet, she still suffered the full punishment, and she still died as a result of it. The legal reasoning for this was that trial by ordeal was supposed to reveal God's will. If she survived, God had judged her innocent, but the survival itself proved nothing about actual guilt or innocence. It only proved that she was lucky enough or strong enough to survive a torture technique that was designed to kill. In the German regions, There's extensive documentation of what happened to women who were branded. The marks didn't just prevent escape and social integration. They prevented marriage. If a woman was ever released from punishment or escaped her town and ended up in another community, and if someone recognized her mark, she couldn't marry. No respectable man would marry a woman branded as an adulteress. She was permanently outside the possibility of legal partnership or social integration. Some women tried to escape their marks by paying surgeons to cut them off. The records show attempts by women to have A's branded on their cheeks removed surgically. But the scarring was so deep that removal often just replaced one obvious mark with another. A scar that looked like scarring from removal was almost as identifying as the original brand. A document from 1004 in the city of Bruges shows a woman named Catherine who tried to have her brand removed. The surgery was performed by a barber surgeon, the closest thing available to a medical professional. It didn't work. The scar tissue was permanent. When the attempted removal was discovered, Catherine was brought back to court and sentenced to additional punishment for attempting to evade justice. She was branded a second time. This time the brand was applied to her other cheek so that she was marked on both sides of her face. There was no way for her to hide it. The social consequence of this layered punishment, branded, then punished again for trying to remove the brand, was total. Catherine left Bruges. She ended up in the countryside, living as a hermit in a small hut outside a village. She survived by begging and doing menial work that no one else wanted to do. She died in that hut at age 42. In convents across Europe, the records show that imprisoned women sometimes tried to take their own lives. The documents are cryptic. They use phrases like, "she was found to have attempted harm to herself," or "she was prevented from taking the ultimate escape." But what they're describing is suicide attempts. The church's response was to increase surveillance. Women who tried to harm themselves were locked in smaller cells. Their food portions were reduced. They were beaten after each attempt. The message was clear: you don't get to escape this. You're going to stay alive and suffer for as long as possible. A chronicle from a German convent in the 15th century describes a woman named Beatrice who had been imprisoned for allegedly committing adultery. After 5 years of confinement, she tried to starve herself. The nuns responded by force, feeding her. They would hold her mouth open and push bread down her throat. The chronicle notes that this happened 3 times per week for 6 months, until Beatrice accepted her penance and ceased her attempts at self-harm. Beatrice lived in that convent for 32 more years. She died at age 71 after spending nearly 40 years imprisoned for an accusation that was never proven. The documentation of these cases is often remarkably detailed. Medieval clerks kept records. Church officials documented punishments. Legal codes were written down. The system wasn't hidden. It was public. It was official. It was sanctioned by both church and state. And it was consistent across centuries and regions. Whether in England or Germany or Italy or France, the principles were the same. Whether in the 13th century or the 16th century, the methods evolved, but the purpose remained constant. Destroy any woman who was accused of adultery, make her an example, terrify every other woman into absolute obedience. The sheer consistency of the cruelty across such a vast geographical area and such a long time period reveals something important about medieval civilization. This wasn't aberrational. This wasn't the product of a few sadistic individuals. This was systematic. This was systemic. This was what the civilization itself was built on. Every legal code reinforced it. Every church supported it. Every community participated in it. Generation after generation of women grew up knowing that this was what awaited them if they deviated. If they were seen talking to the wrong man. If they smiled too much. if they showed too much interest in anything beyond their narrow domestic sphere, if they were accused by a husband who wanted to get rid of them. The control was total. The fear was constant. The system was airtight. And what's most important to understand is that this all happened in what we call Christian civilization. In the most advanced, most educated, most civilized part of the world at that time, medieval Europe was capable of building cathedrals and universities and complex legal systems. It was capable of great artistic achievement and intellectual advancement. And it was simultaneously capable of organizing systematic, normalized, legalized violence against women based on accusations that couldn't be defended against, and that often had no basis in reality. That's the human capacity that we need to grapple with. Not just the cruelty itself, but the ability of entire societies to normalize that cruelty, to build legal systems around it, to teach it to children, to make it seem reasonable and just and necessary. Elena died sealed alive in a cell. Marjorie died in a ditch, her body so damaged by infection and illness that she couldn't survive. Isabella died locked in a convent after spending 23 years in a cell. Alice died on the roads, mutilated and abandoned. But they weren't unique. They were examples of a system that destroyed thousands of women, that destroyed tens of thousands, that destroyed hundreds of thousands across centuries and regions, and the system persisted. In some forms it persists still. Not the branding and drowning and mutilation. Those have been eliminated by legal reform. But the underlying principle that women's testimony about their own behavior cannot be trusted, that male accusation carries more weight than female defense, that women can be destroyed by accusation even when innocent. That principle has longer staying power than any of us want to admit. This is why history matters. This is why these stories need to be told, not just because they're shocking, though they are, but because they reveal the capacity of human civilization to organize around the destruction of an entire category of people. And they remind us that every protection women have now was fought for. Every right to testify, every right to defend herself, every presumption of innocence, every protection against cruel and unusual punishment.